The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, it is March. The weather's supposed to be getting good. I'm jealous because everyone's either in Arizona or Florida in the Grapefruit League or the Cactus League. But hey, we're ready for another show of Genesis today. And as always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. And again, we come back with a recurring guest, Dr. Jerrold Casway. We're going to be talking about the 1800s and the Negro Leagues. And Dr. Casway's been on our show previously to talk about the Irish in baseball, to talk about his wonderful book, The Culture and Ethnicity of 19th Century Baseball. And out of this carves many, many different factions. One of those factions is the Negro Leagues, which we will be touching on today, and how it related to the 19th century and the 1800s. We're not going to get into what happened when they officially formed in 1920 under Rube Foster, but we will be touching upon really, really good subjects, which shows the pioneering days and what happened with African Americans and how racism slowly divided the leagues. We'll talk a little bit about Cap Anson. We got Octavio Cotto. We got Bud Fowler. We got Moses Fleetwood Walker. We got a great show. But first, I beg for station identification, and you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with our fearless leader, producer Ralph Tycho, and there are so many shows on. And now the baseball season is coming up, and spring training is well underway, and of course most of the Northeast today will be under a blanket of snow, rain, sleet, or ice, wherever you may be. Hey, we're always doing baseball for you. And, what we're going to learn today is very, very important to the history of baseball, because I always said, if baseball was integrated long before Jackie Robinson, the numbers, the stats, everything would have changed, because these players were so good and were so unfortunate to not have the same color of skin which America had dictated at the time. It was a sorry society. I'm glad it's long gone. But these players were so instrumental that when you could see the effects, when Jackie integrated the league in 1947, and 46 into the minors if you want to be technical, then you had Larry Doby in the American League, and you could see in the 1950s when the National League integrated more so than the American League, what the quality of teams were. And a lot of the American League teams, especially my Yankees and the Red Sox, where I'm living up now, they were the last to integrate. It showed a lack of respect, which harked back to these days, and it was unfortunate because they missed out on great players like Hank Aaron and Willie Mays and Roberto Clemente. And all these guys made the National League a powerhouse that when the Yankees finally did end their dynasty in 1964, if you look at the Cardinals, if you look at the Dodgers, especially with the draft, if you look at all those teams, they were thoroughly integrated, which contributed to better teams with a more flavor and a more population by which the American leagues failed to do. And that was important. But, hey, Dr. Casway is a professor emeritus of history at Howard Community College in Columbia, Maryland. However, these days, hey, he's spending his time in Cape May, which is great. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Dr. Casway.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's always good to have you back. Now, I'll let you begin the discussion. When you were writing the book over here, 19th century, I begin with, I believe, Octavio Cotto. Let's talk a little bit about him and his importance.
Octavius Cotto and the team he was affiliated with the Pythians of Philadelphia, were really trend-setting and establishing precedents that we wouldn't see the consequences of for a whole century. Number one, they were a very competitive black team. Most of the players from the team were affiliated with the educational or economic institutions in Philadelphia, where the Pythians were from. He was a graduate of the Institute for Colored Youth, which was the first, secondary educational facility for blacks in the country, I believe. And he was eventually was a teacher of mathematics and classical languages there. But more importantly, he was the captain and second baseman and sometimes shortstop for the Philadelphia Pythians, which was a very successful black team. Cato originally got his experience by playing cricket, believe it or not, in Philadelphia, on a vacant lot in the center of the city, which kind of surprises many people. But again, many of the early baseball players had a cricket background or had cricket experiences. Cato was a good ball player. I don't know whether he was great, but he was a very good and effective ball player. And the Pythians ultimately merged from a number of different African-American teams in Philadelphia to form the core of the Pythian club and organization, which was pretty complex because they for the most part, had sort of a dual objective. One, of course, was to play ball, something that they absolutely adored and relished. But they also saw baseball as a vehicle to create sort of a brotherhood on a field of green. They really wanted to see baseball as a means for reconciling the black and white communities. What was interesting about this is that this was also an era where civil rights are starting to become a major discussion. And what the Pythians would do is that they would communicate with other black teams in the East Coast, in New York, and Washington, and Baltimore. And while they were playing ball with them and having picnics and social gatherings, they were also talking about a political agenda in terms of how would they go about, developing and promoting the civil rights platforms and policies. And that was, a very important factor here. An interesting facet of this was Cato's fiancée, a Caroline. She was 100 years before Rosa Parks. She did what Rosa Parks did on the Philadelphia trolley cars, horse trolleys, and which ultimately would be desegregated because of the work that she did and the support she got from Cato and other members of that team and different civil rights organizations that circulated around Cato's ball club.
And, he also was acquainted with Frederick Douglass and other black leaders, and they formed a recruitment committee. And what they wanted to do is they really wanted to fight for emancipation, especially after the Civil War.
Absolutely. Frederick Douglass's kid, I believe his name was Charles, played third base for the Washington black team, and when these games were in Washington, on a couple of occasions, newspaper items mentioned that Frederick Douglass was in the audience. He was sitting with the spectators, rooting for his son's team. But again, it goes back to that whole idea of they couldn't do a lot of these things openly, but in the guise of baseball, they were able to have this kind of communications and dialogue with like-minded intellectual, intellectual, but educated blacks for the purpose, again, of fostering and promoting, again, civil rights and emancipation rights.
Hey, Professor Casway, Cotto was in Philadelphia, but what was odd about this story was when they went to go vote on Election Day in 1871, October 10th, he was gunned down right in the middle of the street.
He was assassinated. We can't really prove, we really can't prove that it was a deliberate thing, but I think he was sought out and ultimately shut down as a result of his actions and his influence. In Philadelphia now, they just put up a statue outside of City Hall for Octavius Cato, and there are a number of murals that are being painted around the city for Cato, which is kind of interesting because the work I'd done on Cato and Harry Silcox had done on Cato were done 25, 30 years ago. But it's great that he's being rediscovered and promoted, and his work and his values and his ideals, again, are getting the kind of esteem that they deserved from the Civil War period.
And it's so odd because Pennsylvania had all those great teams later on, the Pittsburgh Crawfords, the Homestead Grays, the Philadelphia Stars, that this type of violence was going on in Philadelphia.
Well, Philadelphia had the racial violence, well before the Civil War. A lot of it was stirred by some of the Irish communities there. Matter of fact, one of the most noteworthy things that I write about in the book, the chapter on Cato, is the fact that the Pythians didn't have a place to play, so they would try to get down to South Philadelphia to the Wharton Parade Grounds, or they tried to take the ferry over to Camden. But to do that, they had to go through, again, an Irish neighborhood. And they said that on Bainbridge Street in South Philadelphia, that was the deadline. That once you pass that line, you're open to all kinds of harassment and all kinds of aggression. And it wasn't until they came down there in mass that they were able to break through the Bainbridge Street obstacle and be able to play ball more freely. Because remember, they played baseball, particularly when they played in Philadelphia, at the pleasure of the white teams. And it was the white teams who controlled the ballparks. And the fact that they played most of their games in white-owned stadiums is, it says something about, the ownerships and the city. But at the same time, they also could be, restricted and kept out of that. So they really are harnessed in regard to where they can go and what they can do by the fact that they didn't control the ballparks.
And that whole day, there's so much involved in there. Lieutenant Haggerty was later arrested because he encouraged the police under his command to keep African Americans from voting. The guy who killed Cato, or was accused of killing him, Frank Kelly, he was never convicted of murder or assault.
They brought him to trial about 10 years after the fact, and to all the evidence that was given, he was not convicted.
Unbelievable.
He was not convicted.
Unbelievable. And something, Octavio Cano is one of those people that we must remember because, again, in an age where black people were not educated and were tried to be kept down, he was an educator. And besides being an educator in the civil rights, he preached sports, not only baseball, but like you mentioned, crickets and others, so that African Americans could keep up with the exercising and, of course, health. Now let's go to Bud Fowler. What's his story?
Well, Fowler is, again, a few decades after Cato. By the way, I might mention that the Pythians were the first team to play a white ball club, and at the same time, they were the first team to play in white venues, in white-owned stadiums. And that in itself, in the mid to late 1860s, is really quite a remarkable record, a remarkable achievement. As for Fowler, by this time, Jim Crow baseball is again very much in play, and he has problems. He has problems because he's a good enough ball player again to play in the top leagues against top competition. But the problem is that many people, many of the other ball players, who were predominantly, of course, white, were very upset about playing with him. And if they played with him, they made his life miserable in terms of, sliding into him, hitting him with pitches, doing anything to either get him off the field or to dispel any credibility that he might have as a ball player. And that in itself is quite significant. You have to remember that whether it begins with Cato or ends up, going into the 20th century with the Negro Leagues and the suggestion again of integration, we see the problem of what is called white privilege. White privilege. You see it first with the Irish in the Emerald Age of baseball in the 1880s and 1890s, where they believe that a African American person of color playing a white sport or being employed in a white occupation would demean the occupation. So to avoid that comparison, they try to eliminate them and keep them from participating or competing with them. And what they use as the excuse, again, is the fallacy of white privilege, that because they're white, they had the right and the privilege to play and be employed in certain things, and blacks, people of color, did not.
And the sentiment of the day, especially in the 1870s, with all the Jim Crow laws popping up right after Reconstruction and when the North left, you had a backlash for the loss of the Civil War. And this applied not only in the South, but later on when Woodrow Wilson came to the presidency, he instituted for all government employees that everyone will be segregated as well. They're going to follow the doctrine of separate but equal. And I think for Fowler, even the newspapers got on him. First of all, he was named Bud, because that's what he called everyone. But then, they started, the papers scrutinized him. They called him darky. They called him not a blonde. He was subject to a lot of racism that today you just, you don't hear of these things anymore. But more than anything else, especially Cap Anson. Cap Anson refused to play with another player. I think it was Walker, Fleetwood Walker. Cap Anson, and he's in the Hall of Fame as a great player. Let's talk about Walker now.
Well, Walker and his brother, who played for Oberlin College, again are a classic example of what you were talking about. There's Moses Fleetwood Walker, and there's his brother Welday, and there's a picture on page 18 in my book which shows the Oberlin team, and in it are two light-skinned mulattoes, the Welday, the Fleetwood, the Walker brothers, and they are again, held up again for again their actual race, and people would just not want to be associated with them. So you have to remember that the white attitude, whether it be the Walker brothers or Fowler or Cato, is that the association with blacks would ultimately, denigrate, what the white players or the white workers were doing. It would drag down because the negative connotations again associated with the African American community. So that in itself is going to be a major thing. Now, Anson is sometimes associated with, being responsible for the quote colored line in baseball. He certainly promoted it and was in favor of it. But what people tend to forget is that the large numbers of players on his team were Irish, and they literally refused to either be in the picture or play with them. And if they played with the Walker brothers or any other athlete like Frank Grant, they would treat them horribly, and they were certainly susceptible again to all kinds of injuries and degradations. So whether it be Charlie Grant, whether it be Frank Grant, that's basically what happened.
And being on the subject of Frank Grant, this guy he was named the Black Dunlap, and he was huge. Let's talk about it. He was even in the International League shortly before the Jim Crow laws took over. But this guy was amazing, Frank Grant. I'll let you tell the story.
Well, Frank Grant, again, is a light-skinned mulatto who is very, very talented. If you see pictures of him, team pictures or individual pictures of him, I mean, he looks like a very, very, a placid, laid-back, gentle person. But he was exposed to all kinds of problems. He played second base, and covering second base, people would slide into him with the intent and purposes of injuring him. And I think there was one instance where he tried to protect himself by putting beer keg slats, as like shin guards to protect his legs, because the people would come in with spikes high, hoping to mar or to knock him out of the game. So he was, a person who also was deterred from having a great career because of again, Jim Crow attitudes and segregation.
Go ahead, Dr. Casway, go ahead.
No, there was another character is Charlie Grant. Now, Charlie Grant was also a very, very fine, very slick-fielding infielder, second baseman. He later would play with the Philadelphia Giants, a very prosperous black team in the early 20th century. But Charlie Grant was so good that even John McGraw, when he was with the Giants, when he was with Baltimore, wanted very much to sign him. Now, he was very light-skinned. Matter of fact, he looked more like an Indian than he did an African American. And McGraw said that when he was signing was a Cherokee Indian, and he called Charlie Grant Charlie Tokuhama. And Charlie Comiskey, who was the owner of the Chicago White Sox, sort of put the kibosh on him. He said that that Grant was being fixed up with war paint and a bunch of horse feathers, he said. And he said that if he whitewashed him and to get him in, then he might as well bring him in as a Chinaman. But there was, remember, a lot of people would try to, particularly if they were light-skinned, would promote themselves as being Hispanics, Latinos, and hopefully that would allow them to pass and be accepted again as a person worthy of being employed in the major leagues, or at least the high professional leagues. So it takes all different forms. If you remember in the movie about the Black Leagues in the 1930s, Richard Pryor, remember his role where he plays a guy that's trying to pass for a Cuban, and he was practicing his, speaking Spanish and everything else. And crowds got very upset when they realized that he was not Cuban and not Latin, but really a black player. So this thing takes many, many different forms. Many forms indeed. But what it comes down to is the attitude, again, about blacks. If blacks had any role on these professional teams, it was usually as a mascot, which is also a very, very tragic application, again, of the Jim Crow phenomenon. They were treated horribly, very, very degradingly, and just the examples of Marshall Williams, or called Lucky Williams with the Phillies, or Clarence Duval, who was maybe the most famous of all these characters, who actually accompanied the All-Stars on a worldwide tour. I mean, he was, exposed to terrible and degrading behavior and condescensions. And that in itself just reinforced, if we could do this too, and the blacks could put themselves through this type of experience, then, are they really worthy to be able to be in the major leagues, the professional leagues, to make money by playing baseball? They were just excuses. Just excuses.
You know what bothers me as well? Whereas they would not let blacks into the league, they would let Native Americans in, like Chief Benda, Chief Myers. And when you think about it, when you think about it, all the wars with the Indians to get them off the land, especially with Andrew Jackson. Here's something about Jackson's which is really interesting. He spent his whole life being an Indian fighter, and then when he became president, he threw, of course, the Indians, the Cherokees, out of Georgia, which they had to make their Trail of Tears, which, by the way, if you're ever in space, you could still be seen from all the stuff that they lost on the way there. It was an Armageddon on their way there. No matter what he did to them, he ended up adopting an Indian boy. There's just no logic. Just like there's no logic in baseball here, allowing Native Americans to play, but not allowing African Americans to play. Well,
but the Indian experience is an interesting one. When it did occur, again, great deal of pressure was put on these individuals, and most of these individuals who were American Indian, were also college educated, or had again at least post-secondary school education and training. So the rationale was, number one, they're not black. Number two, they have conformed to white society by acting like white men. And if you ever read the biography of on Chief Bender, you can see how this troubled him throughout his entire career. Despite his successes, his affluence, his influence, he was always conscious of the fact that people looked at him as being an Indian, not just an American, and not just a very, very great ball player.
Yeah, I tend to agree. A lot of these things were just like, it was such a dichotomy and so strange that they would allow all these, whoever they wanted in, especially the Irish. We spoke about how the Irish, were discriminated against when they came here, but they had enough of a legion, especially, like we mentioned, of living in the cities, that baseball became their national pastime, and by the late 1800s, the Irish were firmly established in baseball, especially the likes of Delhappy that we spoke about, and the communities. But again, we also spoke about the mistreatment of all these mascots that took on, their role, and they were treated miserably. Let's go into that, because I still think that is one of the most fascinating things I got out of your book.
Well, Lucky Williams, who was the mascot for the Phillies for about 10 days in the I don't remember which year, but in the mid 1890s. He was treated like a human pet. I mean, they fed him scraps of food. He traveled with the team, but he couldn't ride in the railroad cars. He rode on the top, on the roof of the cars, and by the time they arrived there, he was full of soot. And what they would do is take him down to the river, and they would wash him as you would wash a pet. Okay, and as soon as the Phils entered a losing streak, which had nothing to do with Lucky Williams, they just abandoned him on some railroad station out in the Midwest. So you have that type of degradation. And Clarence Duval, who was a very, very accomplished actor and an acrobat, he was, he was very small, and they would dress him up again in a top hat and proper clothes. But on the trip around the world, there's an incident in the Indian Ocean where the players, threatened to use him as bait when they saw sharks on the side of the boat. And of course, he ran away from them and hid during this particular episode. Now, these are terribly degrading. And if they could get away with, treating African Americans like that in this very degrading manner, then the association with better educated and athletically skilled players who threaten their positions and therefore their livelihood, they would treat them accordingly. And there's nothing nice or proper about those relationships, because the treatment again of the most demeaning of characters is a reflection of them against the whole race. And like I said before, it goes back to the concept of white privilege. That being white, you have certain privileges and opportunities, even though you may not have been as capable or as able or as skilled as a person of color.
Yeah, and you got it's, and what the thing is, they overlooked the talent, and especially when it came to people like George Stovey, who was widely considered the best African-American baseball pitcher of the 19th century. But discrimination barred him from the majors.
Well, there's a lot of discrimination. One is based on race, and the other is based on just the economics between the various competing leagues. I mean, to this day, the American Association is still not recognized or acknowledged by, for example, the Baseball Hall of Fame. There are no American Association athletes in the Hall of Fame.
And the International League, which was also in the 1800s, Pud Galvin had 350 wins. He was the all-time lefty winner until Warren Spahn beat him by 353. However, all of his records from the International League shows he won 51 more games. Now, if you do that, if you make the calculations, that would give him 401 wins. That would put him third on the all-time wins list behind Cy Young and Walter Johnson. But it's very strange, especially in this era of baseball, the late 1800s and the post-Civil War, what records were taken in and what records were kept out. I mean, the Federal League wasn't really, recognized until 1968, almost 50 years after its demise.
Well, again, all of this stuff goes back to the fact that what you have here is this competition between races and between leagues and between individual organizations. Everyone wants to come out on top, and it won't be until 1903 with the development of the American League that you have an agreement between the leagues to recognize each other and to come up with a series of rules and regulations that they would adopt and apply to their respective organizations, because everyone is literally in a matter of survival. Survival. I mean, the old Darwinian concept of survival of the fittest. Any advantage you could have or apply or imply was to your credit. So whether it was blocking rival ball players who you saw as a threat to your economic success or opportunities. I mean, there were just so many slots in professional baseball, and if you start bringing in competent black athletes, you not only are in their eyes, demeaning the sport, but you're cutting back on opportunities for quote white ball players. You remember when the NBA would only take a number of black players on their teams. What was the reason for that? Same reason you have for the early prejudice against blacks or people of color in baseball, is to maintain a certain percentage again of slots for whites while containing the blacks and their dominance. So when you have a team like in the NCAAs, Texas Southern, that was all black, or the Boston Celtics that basically put out teams that were primarily black, you were challenging and upsetting communities that still went by the concept of white privilege. That being a white person gave you a heads up over or a foot up on, again, anyone who did not conform to race or racial standards.
It's because of these early baseball dealings that the African Americans stopped vying for equality with the whites, and they became more of a community kind of sport, which again, what people don't realize how important these teams were to the economy of the black neighborhoods. They were just as important as church.
Well, they were, and that was their only alternative. If they were going to compete and hone their skills, they'd have to do it on their own. Like the movie said, a league of their own for women in World War II, it really was a league of their own, leagues of their own in regard to the black community, because they would hone and train, attract, have an economy that would revolve around, black baseball. What's interesting about that is that if you look at how baseball was played by many of these teams of color, these African American teams, the style of play that they used is very reminiscent of the Irish style of play that was popularized in the 1880s and 1890s, by many of these, prominent managers, Ned Hanlon, Charlie Comiskey, John McGraw, Bill McKechnie, Huey Jennings, and even Connie Mack. Connie Mack, when he first started managing, again, had all this wheeling and dealing on the baseball field and tried to get the upper edge. And there was an entertainment factor with that, particularly with the old Baltimore Orioles of the 1890s under John McGraw. A lot of this was picked up and popularized again and associated with many of the African American teams and leagues because it was what? It was popular for the spectator and for the viewing audience.
And Rube Foster came along in the early 1900s, and he saw, hey, look, we're going by three different philosophies here by the turn of the 20th centuries. One, you got a Marcus Garvey type of attitude saying, hey, yeah, let's go fight. You have a George Washington Carver kind of
That
attitude.
would not sell tickets, Ian.
Yeah.
See, that wouldn't sell tickets. You had to do something that would conform and entertain, and they sort of copped out to a bit. They weren't the militants; they were more the accommodators.
Right, which I think they took Carver's and what's his name, W.E. Du Bois, thing that you gotta. The boys, you have to stay in the community and do that. One last thing regarding this, regarding the late 1890s into the 1900s. When, in your opinion, did the African Americans, the black community, say, "Hey, you know what? The heck with this. We're going to start our own stuff. We're going to be in our own things. We're going to let the whites do whatever they're going to do, but we're going to capitalize on our abilities, and we're going to play in our own stadiums and our own communities."
Well, the key is they were still dependent on the use of white-owned stadiums. That's number one. But number two, as baseball became very popular in the 19-teens after World War I, the 20s and 30s, these African-American teams were playing and beating and competing with white teams. And they began to get the sense that, hey, we are just as good, if not better, than the athletes and the stars of the white professional leagues. And not that was an answer for them, but it allowed them to be placated by the fact that once we get a chance to play them or compete with them or be in their leagues, we will ultimately, not so much dominate, but we'll be able to compete successfully. And you begin to see that by the 20s and early 30s. And certainly by the 40s, people like Branch Rickey recognized that, the African-American community were paying spectators. And they were filling up ballparks to see black teams. Then why can't they see and come out and relate to, integrated teams? Because, again, what Branch Rickey and Bill Veeck did was, again, it was economics. It was economics. It was better for them. Better for them.
You're absolutely right on that. Let me ask you this one question. Did I forget anything, or did I leave anything out that you would want to say in regards to the Negro Leagues in the early stages of baseball?
Well, there really is. There's so much to talk about. The thing is that, there's a number of black African-American, not black, but African-American organizations within SABR committees where they emphasize and have conferences discussing the role and impact, again, of African Americans. And then at the same time, there are people that are actively working on that. Because more and more letters and papers are being found which tell a whole different story. But underlying that, which is interesting, a good many of the people subsidizing and promoting African-American baseball were white. Why? They could make money from it. So it's an interesting phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon, unfortunately, a product, again, of American society. As American society grew and evolved and matured, our relationship again with our brothers of different color has also matured and developed. And we still have a long way to go. You can see that today. In baseball, fans saying, well, there are too many Hispanics on the team, and there's not enough, white ball players, and so forth and so on. And it's the same thing. The resentment that white jobs are being taken over by people of color or people who are foreigners or different or alien. Things are changing, but they're not changing, rapidly. But in baseball, I might add that the baseball has really grown considerably, and attitudes within baseball and sports in general apparently are much more tolerant and much more promoting of integrated relationships than society at large.
You know what's interesting is that with the whole African American, deal that went down in the 1920s and beyond, I believe today that without the Negro Leagues and without these early people that we spoke about, the major leagues would not still be in business today, because they were falling off the rung well into the 60s, especially with low turnout stadiums and not enough runs to be. I mean, football and basketball eclipsed them as a national pastime by the late 1960s when you had the Super Bowl. But I think that the Negro Leagues and the whole integration of baseball actually saved the major leagues, because it was on its way down. And, especially right after World War II, I think it's evident in the 1944 World Series when the St. Louis Browns played the St. Louis Cardinals. You had all scrubs because everyone was fighting the war. And then you had the rise of unions right after the war. And, of course, a lot of the laws in American society were being lifted against African Americans, and it gave them a chance to play. But without the integration, there would be no baseball. I think it would have been wiped right off the map, which it almost was anyway.
Well, like I said before, baseball, as other professional athletics has demonstrated, if you could prosper, if you can make money, it tends to forgive and forget a lot of the negativities that were associated with the growth again of professional sports. Baseball was the national game. It was termed that in the late 1850s, before the Civil War. To see the national game demeaned by the introduction again of people who were not white Americans. Again, it was something that was difficult to accept and absorb. But again, things basically changed. The athletes were very capable. Money was to be made. And once you saw that, the world was not going to tilt off its axis by integrating sports, it was just accepted. And as I said before, it isn't so much a matter of that, gee, this is the right thing to do, but it's what is being done. And the more that's being done, the more it ultimately becomes part of the accepted standards and expectations, again, of society.
Professor Casway, I always love having you on the show. We did another great take. We'll get you back again. Maybe we'll do a little bit more on the Negro Leagues, and we'll do, what's another fascinating topic which you had in your book regarding Pike? We'll do Jewish baseball players, because like ethnicity, like the Irish or the African Americans, they have a long history too, especially when it came to being prejudiced against, like Mo Berg and Hank Greenberg and, right on down the line. So, you know what? We'll get you back on the show. Hold the line. I'm going to hold the line. I'm going to end the show. Folks, had a great time with Professor Casway again. Always love having him on the show. His book, The Culture and Ethnicity of 19th Century Baseball, is a gem. Go out and get that. And if you don't want to learn more about Irish baseball, you can pick up his Ed Delahanty and the Emerald Era of Baseball, which is the Emerald Age of Baseball, which is another fascinating study. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz, and I want to thank Jerry for being on the show. I love calling him Jerry, and I love calling him Dr. Casway because I just think it's such a cool name. I'd love to have you as my history teacher when I was going for my master's. So, we're going to say goodbye, and as always, I end the show in the immortal words of Emmett R. Murrow. Good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.